Welcome back to the DiscipleSmith's podcast. We're in part 12 today of our journey through the entire Bible in 1 year. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 37 through 39. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up. We're just going to read right through the text and we'll have a little bit of commentary. We are using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. That's the version that just kind of meets us in the middle. It's not exactly a word for word and it's not a paraphrase. It's kind of right in the middle, so it's got an easy to understand, easy to read language. So let's go ahead and get into it. It says here in verse 1 of chapter 37, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. These are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons, because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made a robe of many colors for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. Then Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you really going to reign over us?" His brothers asked him. "Are you really going to rule us?" So they hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream and told it to his brothers. "Look," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He told his father and brothers, but his father rebuked him. "What kind of dream is this that you have had?" he said. "Are your mother and brothers and I going to come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. His brothers had gone to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "Your brothers, you know, are pasturing the flocks at Shechem. Get ready, I'm sending you to them." "I'm ready," Joseph replied. Then Israel said to him, "Go and see how your brothers and the flocks are doing, and bring word back to me." He sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. A man found him there, wandering in the field, and asked him, "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for my brothers," Joseph said. "Can you tell me where they are pasturing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man said. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph set out after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him in the distance, and before he had reached them, they plotted to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. We can say that a vicious animal ate him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let's not take his life." Reuben also said to them, "Don't shed blood. Throw him into this pit in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him," intending to rescue him from their hands and return him to his father. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped off his robe, the robe of many colors that he had on. Then they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. They looked up, and there was a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying aromatic gum, balsam, and resin, going down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And they agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone. What am I going to do?" So they took Joseph's robes, slaughtered a young goat, and dipped the robe in its blood. They sent the robe of many colors to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it. Is it your son's robe or not?" His father recognized it. "It is my son's robe," he said. "A vicious animal has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth around his waist, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." And his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard. At that time, Judah left. This is chapter 38. At that time, Judah left his brothers and settled near the Adulamite named Hira. There, Judah saw the daughter of the Canaanite named Shua. He took her as a wife and slept with her. She conceived and gave birth to a son and named him She conceived again, gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to another son and named him Shelah. It was at Shezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Now Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife, perform your duty as her brother-in-law, and produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he released his semen on the ground so that he would not produce offspring for his brother. What he did was evil in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought he might die too, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had finished mourning, he and his friend Hira, the Adulamite, went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers. Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she took off her widow's clothes, veiled her face, covered herself, and sat in the entrance to Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah. For she thought that, though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her and said, "Come, let me sleep with you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me for sleeping with me?" "I will send you a young goat from my flock," he replied. But she said, "Only if you leave something with me until you send it." "What should I give you?" he asked. She answered, "Your signet ring, your cord, and the staff in your hand." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she got pregnant by him. She got up and left, then removed her veil and put on her widow's clothes back on. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite in order to get back the items he had left with the woman, he could not find her. He asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who is beside the road at Enaim?" "There has been no cult prostitute here," they answered. So the Adulamite returned to Judah, saying, "I couldn't find her, and furthermore, the men of the place said there has been no cult prostitute here." Judah replied, "Let her keep the items for herself, otherwise she will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send this young goat, but you couldn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has been acting like a prostitute, and now she is pregnant." "Bring her out," Judah said. "Let her be burned to death." As she was being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message, "I am pregnant by the man whom these items belong." And she added, "Examine them. Whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these?" Judah recognized them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her intimately again." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread around it, announcing, "This one came out first." But then he pulled his hand back, and his brother came out. Then she said, "You have broken out first." So he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread tied to his hand, came out and was named Zerah. Verse 39, or chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor in his master's sight and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he had owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned, in his fields and in his house. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in his house. and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do such a great evil and sin against God?" Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment with her and run outside, she called to the household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so that he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. When he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment with me and ran outside." She put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story. "The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment with me and ran outside." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, "Though these are the things your slave did to me," he was furious, and he had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful. Father, may you bless the reading of your word here this morning, and may it just transform and shape our minds to better understand and know your will. Amen. Okay, so we're going to get into this commentary here of Genesis 37 to 39. But to give kind of a backstory and to catch you up on kind of where we've been, we've seen the creation of the world, the creation of humankind, creation of Adam and Eve as the first two people. Then Cain and Abel, that story where Cain kills his brother Abel, and Seth comes along to replace Abel. We follow the bloodline of Seth as all of his descendants are among these pagan kingdoms. And so you have different pagan worship rituals of foreign gods who are announced as these demon characters that are wandering around the earth, and they're worshiping them and doing all kinds of horrible, evil things. So God chooses to separate one people group, and they are of the line of Seth, to be his chosen people. So that's the nation of Israel. He calls Abraham out of this pagan sort of community. Abraham has his son Isaac. Isaac has his son Jacob. Now Jacob is renamed Israel. God literally changes his name to Israel. Israel has 12 sons. And so we're seeing these sons and sort of how the nations are going to be formed, or how the different tribes of Israel are going to be formed. So that's where we're at, all the way up to this point where the 12 tribes of Israel have been born, and we sort of get a focus in on a day in the life, so to speak. So Israel has a favorite out of the 12. It's Joseph. He was born in Jacob's old age, and he just prefers him. He gives him this coat of many colors. I'm not sure what that signifies, other than he gives his son just this blessing of a special robe and places it on him. Now, that already ticked his brothers off. They're already jealous. Where's their coats at? Why didn't I get a coat? If any of you have siblings, you may know that it seems like parents pick favorites out of the group. Now, if you don't think that, then maybe you are the favorite of your family. But I couldn't imagine having 11 other brothers. I only have one sister in my family. But and just by the way, I was the favorite out of our family. So if she ever happens to listen to this, she might get a kick out of that. But we got along just fine. We had our fights and things like that. However, Joseph ticked his brothers off pretty good, because he started talking about these dreams that he was having. First of all, he has a special coat. Second of all, he starts having these dreams where um, he gathers these plants, and the plants start worshiping him, and it's about his brothers. And so his brothers are like, "What? Are we going to bow down and worship you, even though you're the younger brother?" Then he has another dream that stars in the sky come to worship him, and that represents the 11 other brothers, as well as Joseph's parents coming to worship him. And so that kind of ticks his father off as well. Now, these were just dreams placed on his heart, I believe, by God directly. I think God speaks through dreams. I think he can very clearly reach us. I have a theory that maybe when we sleep, our brains, our soul, and our spirit are somehow closer connected to the spiritual world than the material world. And so we need to sleep every night to sort of connect that spiritual side to the physical side. I also believe that we're designed to sleep at night. That's whenever darkness is. Whenever we tend to see this imagery of satanic, evil spirits, that sort of thing. And so darkness always represents chaos and disorder. Sometimes it represents evil. We talked about the wilderness already. And so when we sleep at night, especially, that can be where we are closer to the spiritual realm. Now, if we're saved, we're in Christ, that is a time of communication with God. If you're not saved and you're not in Christ, then that may be a time where spiritual forces are able to attack your heart and your mind. I think about different nightmares that you may have, different fears that you may have, but that's not what God has for you. He didn't give you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind. So God speaks to Joseph in these dreams. Joseph's brothers get ticked, decide they're going to murder him. Now, I've never wanted to murder my sister. There may have been times where she wanted to murder me. I was the younger out of the two of us, but I never really had that thought. So they throw him in this pit, and they decide that, well, instead of murdering him, we're just going to sell him into slavery. And that's what happens. Some Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael, remember Isaac's brother Ishmael, who was born from the slave girl Hagar, his descendants were coming by. They bought Joseph, and they sold him to an Egyptian named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was apparently a pretty high-up-ranking official in Egypt, and so we're going to get a story with him here in just a moment. But the story in chapter 38 kind of comes back away from Joseph. It hits the pause button on that and moves over to Judah, one of the other brothers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, there's a lot of kind of gross stuff that happens in this chapter, but one of the things you need to see and be aware of, a lot of this makes sense if we keep with our bloodline theory, that the bloodline needs to remain pure, because the pure bloodline is God's chosen people. Now, one day, Jesus is going to come, and the bloodlines aren't going to matter, because Jesus is going to break the curse of sin that is placed on the Gentile nations, anybody who's not of Jewish ancestry. However, here, Judah is going to take a foreign wife. That was the custom of the area, but that was not the custom that God set in place. So here was Judah going to perform this evil act and take a wife from and some death happens, right? And so God actually directly intervenes and kills a couple of people in this instance. And God is attempting to preserve this bloodline as well. And so she goes through a couple of the brothers who won't marry her, and God kills them. And then finally, her father-in-law, his wife, dies, and she is going to sleep with him so that the bloodline can continue. So she tricks him into sleeping with her and getting her pregnant to preserve the bloodline. Now, a strange story happens where, as she was giving birth, she was having twins. One of the twins reaches his hand out. They tie this scarlet cord around his hand, and then he brings his hand back in, and the other brother is born first. Now, something to note here is that the brother who came out first is Perez. And Perez is actually where the line of Jesus is traced, and King David. And so we get this story here and this preserving of the bloodline. And it is of such importance that even the Messiah, the Christ, came through this sort of bloodline. So we're seeing this already in the Old Testament. We get into chapter 39, where it moves away from Judah and that messy craziness, and it moves back over to Joseph. Remember, he's in Potiphar's house. He's been sold as a slave. However, God has granted him favor in all of this household, and so everything that Joseph touches just turns to gold. He, not literally, but metaphorically. And so they're just, the Egyptians are just, Potiphar especially, is reaping the benefit of Joseph being in his house. So he puts him in charge of anything. Anything I just trust you with everything. Now that's a pretty remarkable thing to do. But I guess Potiphar was gone a lot, so Potiphar's wife started looking at Joseph and thinking he was handsome, so she started trying to sleep with him. Joseph was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And this happened for a while. All the slaves were gone one day, and Potiphar's wife decided to make her moves on him. Joseph escaped by, she grabbed his garment, and he tore his garment off and jumped out the window, I guess. And so she made up this story that, he was trying to force himself on her, and, she screamed, and that's whenever he ran off, blah, blah, blah. So he gets moved into this prison, and in this prison, he, once again, has the favor of the Lord and regains some of this favor, and he is put in charge and under authority of all the things in the prison as well. They just trust him wholeheartedly. And so in the next part, in part 13, we're going to start looking at Joseph's story in a little bit more detail. I thank you for tuning in today, and appreciate you sticking along with this. This is the part 12 in our series through the entire Bible in 1 year. My name is Kevin, and this has been the DiscipleSmith's podcast.